Delighted to have a guest out here from Washington. Paul Steris is the General John Vesey Senior Fellow for Conflict Prevention, and he's the director of the Center Preventive Action at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's an expert on conflict prevention and a regular commentator on current affairs. And he's the author of 9 books, including his latest, which is Preventive Engagement: How America Can Avoid War, Stay Strong, and Keep the Peace. So there's a prescription for us today. Right. And I think, certainly looking around the world today, there are many potential wars or conflicts that we could get into. So I'm curious, what do you see as the biggest threats on the horizon, and how can we avoid them?
Okay, well, thank you, Siobhan. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be back in San Francisco. There's some friends and family in the audience, and it's great to see them too. And I'm particularly grateful to the World Affairs Council for this opportunity to be here tonight and talk about my book. So at the risk of sounding like I'm giving you the bait and switch, I don't have a specific war in mind that we're wanting to prevent. That's not to say that we're not likely to get into a war in the short term. I think the risk is actually growing. The world is growing more turbulent and disorderly. You're looking at increasing great power or major power friction on various parts of the world. You're seeing certain regions racked with greater instability and violent conflict. You're seeing the emergence of non-state actors who may have access to dangerous materials and other technologies. And there's also the long-term risk from climate change, something I think you're very familiar with. And all this presents a growing risk to the United States because as the principal global power and primary defender, if you will, or champion of this liberal international order that's grown up over the last 70 years, the United States has assumed this role as a sort of defender of last resort of any challenges to international order. So it's at greater risk. And if I look out over the horizon now, and if I could really point to, I think, 2 or 3 concerns or incipient conflicts. One would obviously be the Korean Peninsula. The situation is deteriorating there. I think the risk is extremely acute in terms of the risk of war. John Brennan, the former CIA director, I think puts it around 25%. My boss at the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, he puts it at, I think, 50%. There's the Middle East, there's the situation in Iraq and Syria that still, I think, is very dangerous and could draw back the US. To some extent, we're already there, but I think we could see even more sizable intervention from the US down the road. What Saudi Arabia is doing with Libya and Yemen and elsewhere, that could also, to me, represent a risk too. So they would be my principal concerns. I can tell you some others, but they're on my mind at the moment.
Certainly a lot of areas to be looking closely to. Your book comes at a very interesting time when there's strong arguments to increase our military budget, while at the same time to decrease our diplomatic budget, and also to perhaps withdraw from the world stage in certain areas. If you had the opportunity, how would you make the argument for preventive engagement to this administration?
So I would make the argument in the following ways. I would say that the risk of costly conflict is growing for the reasons I mentioned. It's already, over the last 15, 16 years, already cost the United States an extraordinary amount of money. And I'm not just talking financial cost. I think we're up to $6 trillion now, the cost of Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a lot of money, which we could have spent elsewhere. There's the 6,000 plus lives lost and tens of thousands that have been maimed. And so there's an obvious, I think, argument to be made that we don't want to get into costly conflicts that distract us from domestic priorities, which we all know we need to address, and into wars that could, over time, weaken us as a global power. As you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from Britain, and I grew up in a time where British power was contracting around the world, and I was acutely aware that the demise of Britain as a global power was largely because of the cost and exertions of fighting many wars. And I worry that over the long term, in the future, as the 21st century plays out, that the US could make the same mistake. And unlike Britain, that could pass the mantle of global leadership to the United States, I'm not sure who we pass the baton to. So I'd make those arguments that we want to maintain a stable environment as possible so that we can do the Make America Great Again at Home agenda. That was what I would say.
Well, even if we're not consciously passing the baton to anyone, or even if there is not perhaps a clear successor, do you think there are other countries that are doing a better job right now about preventive engagement? I mean, if you consider China with their One Belt, One Road initiative, or the AIIB bank that they're setting up, are there other examples of people who are thinking longer term about where they want their engagement to go?
Yeah, I can't point to anybody who has articulated a similar approach to shaping the future, managing risk, as I lay out in the book. You can certainly point to leading powers, and you mentioned China, who do have a vision of themselves, certainly in their region. They have a plan to, I think it will be the 100th anniversary of the revolution in 2049 to become a global power. They are clearly positioning themselves in the region to play a much more assertive role. You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a giant infrastructure effort in principally South Asia and Southeast Asia to increase the level of commercial activity, transportation, and that's something that's going to play out over many decades. And interestingly, the Chinese position on multilateral institutions, on climate change, on multilateral trade has shifted. It's almost their narrative is the narrative that we used to give, and now we are articulating a much more narrow, transactional, short-term approach. And it's the Chinese that is looking like the real global stakeholders, or that we've been pushing them to be for many years. And now we're going back into a much more short-term, narrow, nationalistic posture, which I think is regrettable.
In some ways, your arguments in your book feel almost retro in certain respects. And I'm curious that they're coming at a time when there is waning support for international institutions and the global world order that the United States created, and that's really survived in the past 7 decades. What would you argue for why we need these institutions now, or are there different institutions that could better address the problems of today?
Well, you mentioned sort of a fatigue, if you will, amongst the American public, and it's understandable. We've, as I say, spent a lot of money abroad in fighting various wars. We've lost a lot of brave soldiers, and so there's an understandable fatigue with being globally engaged, and skepticism about the value of some of these institutions. And I think people forget how much they actually enhance our livelihoods. And there's all kinds of global regulatory regimes that we benefit from financial attractions to travel, to navigation, to safety. And when you add all these up, it's a huge amount of effort that we benefit from, as do others. And I don't think we do a very good job in conveying how important these institutions and regulatory regimes are to the common good. Now, the UN is an obvious case, and again, it tends to get denigrated, if you will, as a talk shop. But it does a huge amount of things for the US and international order in general. And again, we don't do a very good job, and it's not helped by the president, who also, I think, has denigrated it and said he's going to cut back on funding for it. that's not to say there's not waste and abuse. There is in any organization. But this is the only global institution that has any real legitimacy when it comes to managing major threats to international peace. And ironically enough, it's being used heavily by this administration to manage the North Korea issue, and quite successfully. That's somewhat of an irony that this administration, for its sort of negative talk about the UN, has actually been using it quite successfully. Certainly when in the North Korean case.
Absolutely. And so that's one of these pressing inbox items. And you talk in your book about getting away from just managing the inbox and just dealing with the crisis of today. But it struck me that in some ways Americans we're very impatient people, and we often, planning ahead is not maybe one of our stronger suits. We have FEMA, but we don't have an organization that plans to mitigate disasters. So how do we help policymakers and help our country think more long term about our goals internationally?
Well, firstly, I think we've got to do a better job of actively looking ahead, scanning the horizon, and because our intelligence community tends to be quite short-sighted, not because it wants to be, but the demand signal, if you will, the requests from the White House tend to be very short-term. The intelligence community basically has two real consumers: the military, who are fighting the wars, so that's very short term. It's more or less what's going on today. And the White House, who essentially wants to know, what's happening next week. And the presidential daily brief that is given to the president every day drives a huge amount of effort by the intelligence community. Now, it does some long-term horizon scanning, but it does very little in what I call the Goldilocks time horizon of the next 12 to 18 months of actively trying to discern what are the emerging threats and challenges that we should be focusing on that are likely to draw us into conflict. We're not very good at that, but I think it's not hard to fix that. The planning is more difficult. You have to build up a culture of planning. You have to have the resources, you have to motivate people to do it, to think about the future. The military does a pretty good job, and I used to think it was their own culture of preparing for the future, of shaping the future, and moreover, sort of logistical needs. You can't get an armored brigade or an air wing halfway around the world without thinking how you're going to do it ahead of time. But what I didn't appreciate until I wrote the book was that there is a legal requirement. So the military has to plan. And so I feel like, why can't we replicate that kind of incentive or demand on the civilian side and build up that part? Not as a separate entity, but one that's also integrated what the military is doing.
One of the issues, as you touched on a little bit earlier, that will require longer-term planning is climate change. Mm-hmm. And we're already seeing that it's potentially a cause of conflict. Some people are now saying in Syria that droughts in Aleppo were one of the key drivers of the insurgency. And as we look forward to climate change disrupting people, causing mass migration and other conflicts, how do we, both the United States and as a global community, plan for something that's going to be so widespread?
Well, first off, I think we should continue to observe what we committed to do in the Paris Accords, which is to continue to control the emission of CO2 gases that cause climate change. We should obviously be leaders in the development of green technology and be a real example to others and push them to actually even lower emission controls. Paris was a compromise between many different players, but to signal that we're sort of pulling out, I think is not good. Now, we can identify on the basis of some fairly basic modeling techniques where which countries are likely to be most vulnerable to climate change. We're already seeing this. You mentioned parts of the Middle East where there's an absence of water, potable water, the Sahel, parts of Africa. And so it's not hard to really see where all these different forces are going to come together into a sort of perfect storm, if that's the right analogy, and we can start anticipating what effect that will have on political instability, even international conflict. And so we can do that. Now that's not the only kind of long-term thing we can do. There are about 4 or 5 things that will really, if I may, lessen the risk of conflict over the long term. Promoting international trade and investment. There are clear economic benefits, but it's actually a very strong correlate to international peace too. Democracy promotion, good governance also. We all know democracies don't typically go to war with one another. Promoting state building, again in vulnerable states particularly, is a very strong long-term risk reduction effort, because states that reach a certain level of development, and people have even put precise figures, it's around $5,000 per capita GDP, very, very rarely fall back into civil conflict. So if we really want to reduce the long-term risk of conflict in the world, trying to raise the economic development and the efficacy of their state institutions is probably one of the best things to do.
As Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's sometimes hard, though, particularly for someone going to justify for Congress a budget. How democracy promotion, for instance, saves us money. I think one of our generals famously said, if you don't give the State Department more money, you got to give me more bullets. But how would you articulate a vision of how we actually put our resources to this question?
Right. So in my book, I argue that it's, what's the term, not revenue neutral, budget neutral, that I'm not advocating for a massive increase in how much we spend on foreign operations and military operations, because we spend an enormous amount as it is, and it's a question of reallocating that and redirecting it. The approach I advocate is not a scattershot. It's not like we should try to solve every conflict. We should try to raise development in every country. We should come to the aid of everybody, much as we would like to help people in distress, but we do have to make choices. We do have to prioritize where we're going to be. And I think when we ask for funds from Congress, we should demonstrate 2 things. One is that we are being discriminatory, if that's again the right word, in how we choose our priorities. And secondly, that we will seek partnerships in doing this. This is not something the US should take on alone. Or can, frankly. These are huge problems that require the assistance of others. And so I think conveying to Congress that we intend to work with others, not just mobilize their resources, but help build their capacities so they can actually take the lead in doing some of the issues. In some of these areas where our interests are pretty minimal, their inclination is going to be stronger. So we should try to build up their capacity to help themselves. And so that's the pitch I would probably make to Congress.
You draw a really interesting analogy in your book to public health in terms of the different tiers of public health strategies. Right. Could you explain how you would apply that to diplomacy?
Yeah, so the strategy I advocate, preventive engagement, is very much inspired, informed by the approach that we use essentially every day for public health and public safety problems. And it's essentially as you say, a sort of multi-layered, concurrent, mutually reinforcing strategy in which you initially try to reduce the risk factors associated with the problem, say infectious disease, and many of us will try to follow at least healthy lifestyles, good diet and exercise to reduce the risk of becoming ill. And it's not that we see signs of it, but we're just lessening the risk. And so the first part of the strategy is kind of doing the things I discussed, of lessening the risks that associated with violent instability and conflict. The second level is crisis prevention or secondary prevention. It's about when you see early signs of something bad happening, you try to address it immediately. You go to the doctor or whatever to help reduce or settle it before it becomes a major problem. When it does become an issue or critical, you seek emergency care, and that's the third level. That's managing ongoing conflicts in a way that lessens the likelihood they escalate, they spread to other neighbors, and we're drawn in as a consequence. So they're the kind of the three layers, and it's pretty much the strategy that has proven to be successful, not just for infectious diseases. I see it often in how we address violent crime around America. A lot of the police chiefs of major metropolitan areas pretty much adopt that strategy because they recognize it doesn't matter how many cops on the beat, they just can't deal with it, and they want to manage this problem in an upstream way as well as having to deal with it on the streets. So that's the general approach. I think it's a fairly simple, easily understandable approach, and one that translates into foreign policy and security policy.
As you're scanning the horizon today, can you think of areas or countries that would fit into each of those three tiers?
So, the long term is pretty much addressing our relationship with particularly great powers, but also trying to manage the risk of conflict in some of these poor developing countries. In the crisis prevention, I mentioned the prospects of growing confrontation with Iran. I'm worried about the possibility that our relationship with China could become more adversarial. We're already engaged in a kind of hedging, cautious, somewhat distrustful relationship now, but we could flip over into something that's more overtly confrontational, much like the Cold War. And there are various flashpoints around the periphery of China that could, I think, have a significant effect in shaping our relationship, and that we have to deal with that. Russia, again, flashpoints are there to be seen in Ukraine, in the Balkans, Georgia, and that could have a serious effect. I worry most about our long-term relationship with China, because if that goes sour, then that affects cooperation in many, many areas. In the short term, I mentioned the situation in Korea, Syria, Iraq, the Kurdish issue. That's something I feel could flare up and become a real problem if Baghdad uses or oversteps itself in Kurdistan, and I think there will be calls in this country to come to the aid of the Kurds, given how much they've supported us in the fight against ISIS, and so that could be a driver. These things have a habit of coming out of sort of left field and surprising us. One of the quotes I like to give is the one from Robert Gates, who said, "Our record in predicting the next conflict has been perfect. We've been perfectly wrong every time." And so that's humbling, but it to me shows that we can do a better job, frankly, in trying to see ahead and where the main threats are.
As you were doing your research for this book, did you develop any ideas about why we are so bad at anticipating, and whether there's anything that we can do to try to get better? Given that this is San Francisco, I feel like I should ask a data question. Do you think there are any, should we be using data better to help our analysis and our planning?
Yeah, there are plenty of techniques for doing it. We use them in commercial life. We use them in, for medical practice and epidemiology and checking risk factors and so on. A combination of both qualitative and quantitative approaches are out there. That's not the same with predicting the future. It's just really about being sensitive to risk and being able to identify how risk changes. And we've I think in some areas have done pretty well. There's an effort funded by the CIA called the Political Instability Task Force, and they claim 80% confidence rates when it comes to predicting political instability on the basis of, I think, 4 or 5 variables. That's pretty damn good. We do an annual look ahead every year. Some of you may fill out the forms. We've just closed it for 2018, and we send around a survey of, I think, 30 plausible contingencies to foreign policy experts. We ask them, tell us how likely you think they are and how consequential or damaging they would be to U.S. interests. And we've been doing that now for 10 years. And I would say our batting average is pretty good. If it were baseball, it would be Hall of Fame, I think. And that's pretty crude, frankly. We can do better. It's really about, as I say, this demand signal. If the president and the senior advisors want it, they will get it. I've talked to senior officials at CIA, and they said they'd love to do longer range strategic analysis. It's not as if they are deficient in smart people and resources to do it. It's really that there's this sort of short-term vision or driver of much as what you do. You've served in government, and you know the tyranny of the inbox, and it's hard to break out of it. And so you really need to be disciplined. You need to resource that area, incentivize people, and give them the tools to do it.
And then it all comes down to a choice as well. Once we know what's on the horizon, what's out there, you make the point that most of the wars that we've been engaged in have been wars of choice since the Second World War. What should be kind of a rubric for deciding where to engage in the world today? I mean, we're not particularly engaged with the Rohingya, for instance.
Right.
Should we be doing more? Or are we letting another genocide happen? Or Iraq, should we be increasing our engagement there? What would be the...
Well, I think there's a clear hierarchy of interests that we should always keep in mind. And we should always be mindful of potential conflicts that involve other major powers capable of striking the United States, i.e. going back to a kind of Cold War situation in which for 50 plus years we were under the threat of nuclear attack. And some of us can remember, how close we came. And so preventing a situation, a reversal to that, I think is the first priority. The second are potential conflicts that involve a major regional power, a state actor, that can also be extremely costly. And so there are a variety of those that are out there that we could find ourselves in, so sort of major regional conflict. Probably the lower tier are the conflicts where our engagement would be relatively limited, either in terms of the size of the forces or the longevity of the operation. And now many humanitarian contingencies sort of fall into that third basket. And it's not that we shouldn't try to do something, and I think putting the emphasis on upstream interventions so that we don't have to do costly downstream interventions is what we should be trying to do, and that's where sort of regional institutions come into it. But that's the sort of the obvious hierarchy to me. We shouldn't lose sight of that, because we have a habit of every conflict being somehow equally important to everything else, and you have advocates saying, we've got to do something about fill in the blank. And when you say, well, is this more important than, war with China over Taiwan or South China Sea? And they go, well, I guess not. But so that's you've got to have that hierarchy in mind.
And having that hierarchy then helps us both with the sort of all three stages of what you were describing.
Yeah, it allows us to focus on, okay, so these are our priorities, and we're not very good at that.
Right.
But it does then allow us to start the more preventive strategies of planning and so on.
Do you have a sense of what the hierarchy of priorities are of this current administration?
Well, it's got to be North Korea. That's, I think, driving their a lot of their attention at the moment with good reason. I worry that we could stumble into a conflict with North Korea over essentially some incident or miscalculation that escalates. And we seem to think that our immense power will be enough to deter the North Koreans, but we've seen how incidents can escalate and miscalculation can happen. And what I worry about, particularly in North Korea, is that our means of actually managing a serious crisis, say something starts to escalate, is very limited. We don't have diplomatic relations with them. We can't call in the North Korean ambassador to the White House. We can't even communicate by, formal diplomatic communications to Pyongyang because we don't have literally a physical link. We have to go through what is called the New York Channel, i.e. the North Korean ambassador to the UN, and who knows how long that takes. In a fast-moving situation, missiles perhaps, that could take maybe hours. I don't know. Who knows? It has, messages have to be encoded, decoded. You might have to wake up the dear leader, and who knows, and so managing things, and of course it's the other side of the world, so might be middle of the night here, daylight there, and so all these things could really complicate a serious crisis, and I worry about that, and so one of the first things I would advocate, in addition to just trying to get them to desist from further provocative actions, is to try to open up some communication channel to them, even if it's very discreet, so that, hey, if things go bad, we know who to call and how to call if necessary.
Let's hope those calls don't need to be made.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we've got a few questions from the audience here. This first one is, how are countries going to confront what seems like the metastases of terrorist organizations in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia?
Wow, that's a softball question. It's arguably the challenge of our time, that we really don't have a good strategy for managing the threat from terrorist organizations. Our instincts is to use military force and to kill and capture as many as possible. The problem is that doesn't actually solve the problem. It's what the Israelis called mowing the lawn, and it just sort of, if not prolongs the problem, it could also widen it. And I think the use of metastasization is not accidental here. And I've argued that just as the public health model could be useful as a broad strategic framework, it actually could also be instrumental in managing certainly the ideological component of terrorism, because it does propagate much like a disease. The people become quote unquote infected, they become adherents, they get mobilized, they get turned, trained, and so on. And so the strategy for trying to deal with that is similar, frankly, to dealing with an infectious disease. It means looking at the vectors of transmission, the agents involved, and until we have, I think, a coherent, frankly, counter-narrative, we can offer some long-term hope for some of these people, we're going to have this problem for decades. And that's probably the best I can say to that answer.
Well, this question is particularly fitting for a Brit here. What can we learn from Britain's end of empire and the U.S. end of empire?
So the, there's a sort of narrative about British decline that goes along something like this, that the Brits saw the writing on the wall in the early part of the 20th century and suborned American power. They sort of used it, exploited it to help fight and win First World War and Second World War, and the Brits sort of adroitly managed the handover of imperial assets, and in many respects more responsibility than some of the other European powers. From what I've read and frankly felt at the time was that the Brits really had no long-term vision. They didn't think about how to conserve their power and avoid getting drawn into these costly conflicts over time, and frankly just lurch from one crisis to the next, extremely costly, sort of maintaining the pretensions of a great power. And it's cost them. It's still playing out, frankly. I think the Brexit vote is another self-inflicted wound by themselves. So I think to the extent there's a broad lesson, it is that the US does need this long-term vision about its place in this world, the role in the world, and a strategy that can conserve its power, that it doesn't get drawn unnecessarily into these expensive conflicts. As I mentioned, we're up to $6 trillion. It's a lot of moolah that could have been used on bridges, hospitals, schools, what have you.
We use it for similar things in Afghanistan, but
Yes,
not here at home. And speaking of the British Empire, one of our audience members is wondering whether you're concerned about war between Pakistan and India, and how should we engage?
That's been an enduring problem, and the Brits are partly culpable for it, given the way partition occurred, particularly when it came to Kashmir, which is one of the flashpoints in that conflict. The U.S., as actually a example of where the U.S. has acted preventively and in a very sometimes timely fashion, has been in managing several crises involving India and Pakistan. One of the more recent was when militants from Pakistan, supposedly aided by Pakistan intelligence, attacked the port of Mumbai. And India was ready to retaliate, and it was only through timely U.S. action that prevented that from happening. And but that sort of latent risk exists, and some would argue that it's getting worse. There's still exchanges of fire across the line of control in Kashmir. There's still these militant organizations that seem hell-bent on attacking India, with varying levels of support from the Pakistani government. And so that risk exists. What makes it particularly worrisome is that over the years, not only has India developed nuclear weapons, but Pakistan has. It has now one of the largest arsenals in the world. Moreover, many of them are so-called battlefield nuclear weapons that are in the field, can be used at short notice. One has to wonder what the command and control arrangements are for the use of those weapons. So the big fear now is that if there is escalation, it might go to nuclear use very quickly.
Well, that leads us very nicely into the next question, which is nuclear war still a relevant concern among the major powers, or is nuclear deterrence still something we can trust in?
The likelihood of nuclear war between the major powers, I think, is still very low, unless there is some just terrible miscalculation or accident. There is, as I think many of you know, the risk of nuclear weapons being used in any future Korean conflict. I think if the regime in Pyongyang feels so threatened and if there's some invasion, there could be this sort of Gotterdammerung kind of scenario in which they say, hell, we're going to go down with it and use the nuclear weapons. Between the major powers, what I do worry about is that there is this sort of effort, almost in a sort of unthinking effort. I get the logic in which we are looking for ways to essentially undermine the nuclear deterrence of our adversaries. We look at ways to prevent the use of nuclear weapons by Russia or China. We target their forces, we target their command and control systems, and in a serious crisis, and when if relations have really deteriorated, then I worry that that could create this kind of use 'em or lose 'em dynamic in which they may be fearful about the integrity of their nuclear deterrence, and that's frankly not good for strategic stability.
Absolutely. Here's a question about economic investment. What do you see as the trajectory for rebuilding the infrastructure in Syria and Iraq? With all the money that the U.S. has invested in Iraq, do you foresee conflict when other nations will have influence there?
Well, the future of Syria is a big issue. We've got to get to some kind of peace agreement before we can talk about reconciliation and reconstruction. We've still got a long way to go, I think, before that war comes to an end. There was, I think, an attack, was it yesterday or day before yesterday in Aleppo that killed 50, 60 people. It was quite horrific. One can sort of identify the broad contours of a peace agreement. I think the opinion in this country is pretty much shifted to more or less accepting that Assad will be in power for some indefinite future, and that if we can somehow reassure him of his position, and that we don't intend to overthrow him, and we can impose some restraint on other armed forces in the region, that some kind of peace settlement can be reached. It may require the UN, and frankly, in some places where trust and support, or allegiance, if you will, I think it's a better word, with Damascus is totally broken down, and those areas might be under international control. Then you get the reconstruction to work, and I know there's been some reports of the Saudis already sort of thinking about how they can play a role in there. They've certainly got the money. I don't think there would be much public support in this country for us spending an awful lot of money. The Russians don't have any money. EU, I can see collectively playing a role, if only to try to reverse some of the out-migration from Syria, so that some of the people who have ended up in Western Europe can go home. So I can see maybe the EU playing a role. The tin cup always goes to the Japanese in these situations. I don't think this is going to be quite the case this time.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I realize that's one potentially destabilizing issue that we really haven't discussed tonight. What do you see as their growing role in the region?
It's frankly befuddling to me what the Saudis are up to, and it's unclear whether we are actively enabling them with what they're doing, or we're sort of unwitting participants. And so, we've seen their activities, their intervention in Yemen to deal with what they see as a sort of Iranian-backed insurgent movement, the Houthis. And that's become extremely costly to not only themselves, but of course the Yemeni people, and the threat of cholera, I think, has been extraordinary in Yemen. More recently, we've seen this curious incident in Lebanon in which the prime minister resigned from Saudi Arabia, and so are the Saudis actively trying to influence Lebanese politics in a way that marginalizes the Shiite Iranian-backed militia called Hezbollah there? And what does that entail? Does it destabilize Lebanon? Does Israel become more involved in another conflict in Lebanon as a result? Saudi Arabia has also been quite active in Iraq recently too, in a very interesting way. They've been courting Muqtada al-Sadr, a Shiite head of a militia there, and appealing to his sort of nationalist impulses rather than his kind of confessional allegiances to Iran. And so you wonder what's going on there. Bahrain is another place. And so there's all kinds of avenues or conduits in which we could be drawn into conflict in any of these places. We do have these security relationships, most of all with Israel. By doing this, does that lead to an unraveling of this nuclear agreement we've reached with Iran? Now, this administration has already, quote unquote, decertified Iran in that agreement. So they're signaling that they are not keen to pursue it. I think that's frankly very short-sighted. But these other actions, regardless of what President Trump does to decertify the deal, could nevertheless unravel that agreement in another way. And then we're back to a situation we were in 5-6 years ago when people were actively talking about an Israeli strike on Iran, a US strike on Iran. And, there's the fallacy of the last move when we talk about this. The war doesn't end with one or two strikes. There are repercussions. We're in a larger war. It doesn't end there. At least we can't confidently predict that will be the end of hostilities and Iran will back down. And so we're into a major regional conflict. That should be a huge concern to all of us.
Well, and one of the factors in this region is arms sales. And we have a question here about whether we should be supplying arms to Saudi Arabia. Does that promote peace and stability?
Well, it's a tough one because we benefit economically from the sales, jobs, and so on. Yet we can't sell them in an unconditional way, and we've seemingly, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, been willing to sell these weapons without really any say in how they're eventually used. Now, you could say that's just fact of life, and when you sell something to another country, it's up to them how they use it. But I think we have some responsibility to try to constrain Syria Saudi Arabia in this particular context, and that goes for others. Just to make sure that those we're selling the weapons to are the ones who finally receive them. There's all kinds of cases of shipments being diverted and other parties, and we've got to make sure that doesn't happen too.
Shifting our lens further east, we have a question about the South China Sea, and as we saw this summer, how thinly stretched the U.S. Navy is in that area, with growing tensions. What do you think we should do to respond to this, to China's aggression in that region?
Well, they have, as many of you know, occupied these various reefs around the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, and in some cases dredged the coral and sucked up the sand to create larger islands, artificial islands, and they've even putting airfields on some of them. So in some respects, it's already a fait accompli. Now, we don't have to recognize their sovereignty over these. We can insist that through what are called FON exercises for freedom of navigation, that we do not recognize any international legitimacy for these. And so we're in no way accepting this de facto condition. We can make it very clear to them that we will resist them doing any further extensions of activities in the South China Sea. Again, we have to be careful about unintended escalation through miscalculation. So ensuring that there are good communications, military to military communications with the Chinese is very important. Supporting this international arbitration between the Philippines and China is also, I think, which ruled in favor of the Philippines against China. I think it's very important. Reiterating the message in various regional organizations like ASEAN that, again, we don't recognize this, we don't welcome this, and I think is frankly the best we can do. I'm less, to be honest, concerned about escalation in the South China Sea because incidents at sea tend to have a sort of self-containing feature to themselves. They don't escalate as fast as other military incidents on land. And although I am concerned, frankly, more concerned about the East China Sea between China and Japan, there's a lot of nationalist sentiment involved over what are called the Senkaku Islands by Japan, Diaoyu Islands by China. And lines have been very much drawn there, and so I worry that an incident there could escalate just because, as I say, both sides are very entrenched over their claims to those islands. Again, it's the same kind of thing. It's ensuring that an incident doesn't escalate in a unwelcome fashion.
These two questions kind of work together. One is about beyond the White House. Are there other ways that we can kind of create demand points to drive longer-term planning in our government? And secondly, what is the role, if any, of the U.S. media in raising awareness of longer-term issues?
So in addition to sort of internal processes that would incentivize and encourage and resource forward-looking, I argue that Congress should create a national foresight office. I think that's the term I use. Some of you may remember from the 1980s the Congressional Office of Science and Technology that was an independent research organization dedicated to supporting Congress make judgments about emerging science and technology, both in the civilian and military. Some of it was classified, some of it wasn't. It was a terrific agency. It did great work. Unfortunately, it was cut by the Republican House of Representatives in the early 1990s. They saw it as a waste. But I think actually having a national foresight office that does long-range horizon scanning, not just for security issue, but anything, where is the future of artificial intelligence or robotics or climate change, that does good, rigorous, disinterested, nonpartisan research to support Congress. It's not expensive. There are other countries in the world that do something similar. And so that would be one thing. You mentioned, was it media?
Media. Mm-hmm.
Well, the media is very much driven on the here and now, so I'm not sure what role they can do in sort of long-term thinking and foresight, other than some of the rich barons that support various papers. They might invest in it, but I'm not sure what role the media would play here.
Okay. This is perhaps not too long term because it's happened already. Cyber attacks, a whole new area of warfare. How should we respond to those and address them?
Yeah, this is, for obvious reasons, a great concern to many Americans because of Russian interference in the last election. It's not just active disruption of our critical infrastructure networks. It's also manipulation of our media and political processes that is extremely upsetting and frankly disturbing for the future, because the means to do this is becoming more available, and it's not something that this is the preserve of state actors, although they have the most capabilities to really do harmful things. So I think that we have to develop some, at the least, informal code of conduct. We're getting that way with the Chinese, and it's a sort of reciprocal restraint, because it's hard to imagine that this can be formalized in some treaty, thou shalt not, conduct cyber attacks. I think actually the UN has tried it, and I believe there may be a draft international agreement. I'm not sure it says much more than just general principles and so on, but I think reaching a mutual understanding, certainly amongst major powers, not to conduct certain cyber attacks, particularly ones directed at strategic nuclear command and control systems that might cause you to launch accidentally. That would be, I think, a big achievement. Some, again, informal arrangement about not engaging in cyber attacks during elections and other sensitive political events. And because I don't know how this form of warfare or political violence can frankly be regulated. I don't know how you can, it's not like nuclear arms control or conventional arms control for that matter. I just don't know how you can do it. So it just requires sort of behavioral restraint. And if someone has a better idea, then I'm all ears.
Well, on the difficult subject of non-state actors, one area where we have sought to cooperate with Russia is in counterterrorism. Do you think they're a credible actor in fighting ISIS, and are they helping to stabilize the situation, or are they destabilizing?
Yeah. So I actually have a lot of sympathy with President Trump's general desire to improve relations with Russia, and notwithstanding what they did to in the election, but we have to accept that many of these issues, you mentioned terrorism, but also counterproliferation, nuclear safety, not to mention arms control, cyber, managing Syria, we have to work with the Russians. And, we, on a daily basis, we exchange information with the Russians on air operations in Syria to deconflict our different campaigns. By all accounts, that's worked. And, it's not perfect, but it has, as far as I can tell, reduced the likelihood of dangerous incidents happening. Certainly up to a year or so ago, we had high-level exchange of intelligence with Russia over for counterterrorism purposes. And again, I'm told it was pretty good. Law enforcement too, organized crime, money laundering. There are areas where we can, I think, cooperate with them. It's just becoming a hard sell to do politically now, just because of the mistrust that has developed between our two countries as a result of the election.
One last question I think we have time for. Just as a sort of comprehensive last word. What do you think, right now should be our top focus for national security?
Well, as for reasons I mentioned, I think North Korea is the one that we're the most dangerous conflict out there. But I do worry about what's happening, particularly with Saudi involvement and our deteriorating relationship with Iran. And so they will probably be my two highest concerns. There's always the fear that, as ISIS recedes, that there may be some last effort to strike the U.S. homeland. And I'm somewhat fearful that, over the last year or so, knowing that, the forces were closing in on them, that they have thought about striking back at the West in some way, and that we may, wake up one day with a major attack on the U.S. homeland, God forbid. So that's a concern too. I don't think you can ever reduce that concern.
Well, on that
happy note,
happy note, thank you to Paul Stairs for being here tonight, to the World Affairs Council for hosting us, and to all of you for coming and for your interest in this topic. The book, again, is called Preventive Engagement: How America Can Avoid War, Stay Strong, and Keep the Peace. Thanks very much.
Thank you.